Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our daily word this morning. It is Thursday as we continue our long journey together for the daily word. And of course, in this season of Lent, we are deep in this season of Lent as we continue our journey to the cross and to resurrection and to Easter Sunday. So I'm glad you continue to join me for our time together and share in our ongoing conversation through Scripture and what it means for us and how we continue to apply it to our daily lives and how important that is for us and that we use it to share our lives together as we do every day here in our daily word. So this morning is daily word number 874. And I've chosen for this morning from Second Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 through 10. And Paul writes some important words. Paul wants this thorn removed. And God says no, essentially, to Paul. And so we hear these words. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So last night at our Lent Wednesday night, 32 of us gathered. We gathered around the table. We had some great food. We had a taco bar, everything you could possibly imagine. It was so good. And we had cookies and we had lemon dessert and we had some, I can't remember, some other kind of fruit salad. I can't remember what Deb called it. What an incredible gathering of food and then conversations around the table. And I just love listening to those conversations and hearing the rich, deep thoughts that are shared. And then we gather, of course, around the Christ candle and we talked last night, as we always do every Wednesday. We talk about our core, what's at the center of our lives. And last night we talked about grace. And I think the scripture kind of is a continuation of that conversation that we had last night about grace. My grace is sufficient for you, Paul says, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God says, my grace is sufficient for you. You know, I sometimes ask myself the question, and maybe we probably all do, am I good enough? Am I enough? Am I doing a good enough job? You know, I've had this ongoing conversation with a couple of folks. You know, it's I'm about leaving a legacy and how important that is. And you know, I got to thinking last night, gathered around the table, gathered in the circle, with some little kids running around with their moms who are there, moms who were kids who I knew as young kids who now have their own young kids, and some older teenagers who gather around the circle and thinking about the legacy that we want to leave them. And I hope we're doing a good job in it, but I wonder, it bothered me most of the night. Am I enough? Am I doing enough? It's a question that plagues me all along the way because, you know, it's so important to me that they have something to hold on to deep in their life. I imagine for all of us that we can find our own weaknesses rather easily. They're like neon signs that hover over us and we can't figure them out and we're not good enough. Paul, here in this text, wasn't trying to hide his weaknesses. He was given this thorn in his flesh and it tormented him. And in that culture, you know, physical ailments were a huge detriment. They were cause in that culture for shame and embarrassment. But Paul, you know, he didn't want the thorn that he had, and he asked God, he begged God to take it away. But for reasons known only to God, God said no to Paul. But instead of pity or bitterness that God wouldn't answer his prayer, Paul decided to boast about that thorn. boast about the thorn. Therefore, I'll be more gladly to boast in my weakness, so that the power of Christ might completely unfold in me and dwell in me. We talked so much about grace last night, and this scripture that's just a reminder that God's grace is sufficient. We don't have to try, and this is a challenge. It is for me, thinking about all of that last night. We don't have to try to be smart enough or talented enough or strong enough or successful enough or worthy enough or whatever it is. God's grace is sufficient. I had a conversation with a person last night who said, Jim, sometimes it's hard to come on Wednesday because I have so much to do. And I said, yeah, I get it. So much to do. But then the person said, but then listening to you teach us tonight reminded me that this is where I needed to be. And that those other things that are a thorn in my side, they'll wait, they'll be there. The God who dwells inside of us is sufficient for us. It's a reminder that we are enough. Now, I can say all these words, and I believe them to be true. I do. But I'm still going to ask the question, am I enough? Am I doing enough? Am I good enough? The list goes on in those questions. And I'm sure it does for all of us. Paul reminds us, God's grace is sufficient for us. And this text ends, for when I am weak, then I am strong. That's such good news for us that I think we all need to hear again and again and again. That just subtle reminder. So, those things in all of our lives, they're going to remain a thorn in our side. And we talked a lot about them last night. We talked about all the things at our core and the things we struggle with. Our lack of being able to forgive, or our anger, or our jealousy, or, whatever it is, we struggle with those things. Those are thorns in our side. Maybe God doesn't need to remove them as much as God needs to remind us that God's grace is sufficient and that God dwells in us just as we are. So that's the word that I needed to hear today after another night of restless sleep and thinking, asking the question, am I enough? Am I enough? And I think that a question that bugs us all from time to time. So thanks for joining me for our time together this morning. I appreciate it as always. I'm grateful that you could say good morning. And so hopefully you'll join us Sunday morning for worship. We're going to talk about, what are we going to talk about? We're talking about John 3:16 specifically. It's in the middle of that text, but Nicodemus comes to Jesus. But we're going to talk about more than that. We're going to talk about more than John 3:16 that we can put on a sign at a ball game, but how we live it out. So hopefully you'll join us Sunday morning at 10:15, but then here again tomorrow at 10 o'clock. As always, know of God's love that surrounds you and know of my love for you. Have a great day.